Before putting France on a war footing, Napoleon made a final, futile attempt to come to terms with the Allies. They responded by reiterating that he was now outlawed as an enemy of humanity, and would be banished from Europe forever if captured. In theory, the sentence of outlawry also implied that the emperor could be summarily executed if taken. In vain did Napoleon recognize the Treaty of Paris and the 1792 frontiers and send envoys to the Tsar and the Austrian emperor. The Allies were after his blood and would brook no compromise. It would be another fight to the finish. But first the emperor had to put his domestic house in order. All Napoleon's advisors had warned him that this time round he would have to rule France on liberal principles. Accordingly, as early as Lyons he proclaimed a reform of the constitution and the summoning of an electoral college, and his first appointments in Paris seemed to breathe the spirit of reconciliation. Carnot, an opponent of the empire, was appointed Minister of the Interior. Lafayette returned as part of the loyal opposition in the chamber. Even Napoleon Bonaparte was reconciled, as part of the balancing act, in which he tried to reassure both royalists and Jacobins. Napoleon recalled Foch as Minister of Police. This was a bad mistake, for Foch, as always, was acting as the Allies' double agent. Napoleon's greatest catch was probably the 47-year-old Benjamin Constant, a disciple of Germain de Stade and admirer of Madame Récamier. Just days before the emperor arrived in Paris, Constant recorded a typically jaundiced opinion. "He has reappeared. This man died with our blood. He is another Attila, another Genghis Khan, but more terrible and more hateful because he has at his disposal the resources of civilization." But when Napoleon invited Constant to the Tuileries and asked him to frame a new constitution, which would avoid the mistakes of his old imperial system and the excesses of the Bourbons, Constant accepted. Napoleon's first act on restoration was to issue the decrees of the 21st of March, in which he attempted to win over the bourgeoisie. The decrees abolished feudal titles, banished returned emigrants and expropriated their land. But the response to these generous measures disappointed the emperor, and it gradually dawned on him that his only real way forward was to promise to lead the revolution in the direction it was headed when halted by the reaction of Thermidor in 1794. A great demonstration of workers and ex-soldiers filed past him on the 14th of May, urging him to head a war of liberation against all oppressors and to return to the principles of 1793. This was not only unacceptable to his bourgeois supporters, who wanted neither the ancient regime nor 1793 and certainly not the levy en masse, but also to him personally. "I do not want to be king of the Jacquerie," he declared. This was short-sighted. He should have seized the moment, especially since it was self-defeating folly to try to appease the very faction that had ditched him in 1814. The consequence was that the new regime was soon threatening to collapse under its own contradictions. The peasantry became disillusioned when it was a question of dipping into pockets to pay war taxes. There were riots in Paris, Lyons, Dunkirk, Nantes, Marseille and elsewhere, while Carnot's purge of the prefects provoked a conservative and clerical backlash. Napoleon also became aware that French cities were forming federal pacts on the Swiss model, simply adding his name as a legitimating device but making it clear where their real sympathies lay. When he heard the details of the first such pact, between Nantes and Rennes, he sighed and said, "This is not good for me, but it may be good for France." There was also great hostility to the Acte Additional, promulgated on the 22nd of April, by which Constant reformed the constitution. Constant retained the Council of State and the plebiscite based on universal suffrage. There were guarantees of civil liberty, press freedom, an enlarged electoral college, an hereditary upper house, a lower chamber based on a restricted suffrage. But in the May plebiscite to confirm the Acte Additional, Napoleon received just 1,532,527 yeses and 4,802 noes as compared with the 3.7 million affirmative votes he had received in 1802 and the 3.6 million in 1804. In the elections to the chamber, only about 100 of the legislators were fully committed to a war against the Allies. Napoleon's constitutional reforms were a failure on just about every front. It was a mistake for a ruler who professed liberal principles to retain hereditary peers. It was a mistake to call the constitutional refurbishment an additional act, as this implied that the old unpopular imperial system was still in being. It was also an error to reveal the country hopelessly divided as in the past, with massive abstentions in the referendum from the south, west and the urban regions, and enthusiasm only in evidence in the east, north and rural areas. Most of all, the reforms were misconceived because Napoleon's heart was not in them. He admitted to Bertrand that as soon as his position was militarily secure, he intended to rescind the more liberal concessions he had been forced to make. But for the present he played along with the new image of a man who had learned from his past mistakes. "My system has changed, no more war, no conquests. Can one be as fat as I am and have ambition?" The conflict between Napoleon's real and apparent intentions was perhaps revealed by some slips at the ceremony of the Champ de Mai on June, when the Additional Act was formally adopted. In a combined civil, military and religious ceremony, which yoked together proclamation of election results speeches, signatures, a solemn mass and Te Deum, and the distribution of eagles to the army and National Guard, Napoleon chose to appear, for the last time, in the velvety Roman emperor's robes he had worn at the coronation in 804, and when he addressed both houses of the legislature on the 7th of June, the emperor, angered by the way the lower chamber had passed over Lucian as their president, and refused an oath of loyalty to the empire, spoke these ominous words: "Let us not imitate the example of the later Roman Empire which, invaded on all sides by the barbarians, made itself the laughing-stock of posterity by discussing abstract questions when the battering rams were breaking down the city gates." Napoleon had a point, for the Allies had no interest in the supposedly liberal, Jacobin or even royalist credentials of Bonaparte's ministers and legislators as long as the man they had outlawed remained Emperor of France, and the liberal legislators in the Chamber of Deputies were in any case being cynically manipulated by Fouché, who planned to deliver France to the Bourbons. The crucial question for Napoleon was whether he could raise enough troops to deal with the million troops the Allies intended to pour into France. He began by raising 40 million francs in ready cash by trading 4 million of the sinking fund bonds at % for credits on the national forests. He ordered 250,000 stand of weapons, and French arms factories were geared up to turn out 40,000 new firearms a month, while the Ministry of War assured the emperor that 46,000 horses would be ready by June. On the 28th of March, all non-commissioned officers who had left the army were recalled, and by the 30th of April 4 armies and 3 observation corps were in being. Napoleon planned to have 800,000 men fully trained and armed by October I-5. But could he hold out until then and keep the massive Allied armies at bay? His first idea was to fortify Paris and Lyons heavily, hoping to tempt the enemy into protracted sieges which would gain him the time he needed. On the 8th of April he ordered mobilization, but delayed conscription for another 3 weeks. By his old measures of encouraging veterans to return to the colors, incorporating National Guardsmen, drafting sailors, policemen, customs officials, etc., he quickly raised 280,000, but it would be autumn before the 150,000 draftees from the class of 1815 would be ready, and meanwhile draft evasion continued at the high levels of 1813 to 14. But the worst blow was a fresh outbreak of the Vendée in mid-May, which required the diversion of significant bodies of troops. As for officers and generals, Napoleon might have been well advised to follow his own advice on Elba, when he regretted using the marshals in 1813-14 and reflected that he should have promoted able generals with their batons still to win. This was an especially cogent consideration, since those marshals who remained loyal were not keen to fight again. It was the career officers and the old sweats of the Grand Army, attracted by loot, promotion and meaningful employment, who were most eager for the adventure of the 100 Days. The emperor's staunchest support among the marshals came from Lefebvre and Devout, but Napoleon wasted Devout's great military talents by appointing him Minister of War. So many of his marshals were either dead or had defected to the enemy that, with a few notable exceptions, the emperor was left with the dross. Nothing more clearly shows the foredoomed nature of the 100 Days than Napoleon's failure to use the few military talents available to him. Though loyal, Devout, Suchet and Mortier all played no part in the events of June 1815. One who did, albeit indirectly, was the dreadful Murat. As soon as he heard of the emperor's entry into Lyons, Murat feared that the Colossus might soon be bestriding Italy once more. To preempt this, Murat decided to raise Italy against the Austrians himself, under a banner of unification, but was swiftly defeated by the Austrian army, which entered Naples on the 12th of May. According to Henry Houssaye, Marmont was the villain of 1814 and Fouché of 1815, but Napoleon himself thought that it was Murat who was his double nemesis in both years. He had aggravated matters twice, by declaring against France in 1814 and Austria in 1815. As his enemies began assembling their armies, Blücher at Liege with 117,000 Prussians, Wellington at Brussels with 10,000 Anglo-Dutch, Schwarzenberg with 10,000 Austrians on the Upper Rhine, Barclay de Tolly with 50,000 Russians in the central Rhine area, and Fremont with 75,000 Austrians on the Riviera. Napoleon had to decide his strategy. There were only 2 realistic options, either to preempt the Allies by defeating the Prussian and Anglo-Dutch armies before the Russians and Austrians could join them, or to remain on the defensive. The latter seemed the better policy, as it would buy time in which the French themselves could build their planned force of 800,000. Even if the Allies advanced on Paris in the summer, he would have 200,000 men to defend the capital as against a mere 90,000 in 1814. There was the additional advantage that the advancing enemy would have to leave significant detachments behind as each successive fortress was taken. The disadvantage was that large tracts of northern and eastern France would have to be abandoned to the enemy. If, on the other hand, he went for the preemptive strike option and it failed, this would precipitate a much more rapid Allied descent on Paris. It was a tall order to pit just 40,000 men against 224,000 of the enemy, but Napoleon consoled himself with the thought that in 1814, with just 40,000 men, he had won a string of victories against enemy forces 6 times as large. The main advantage of a successful preemptive strike was likely to be political. Napoleon gambled that if Wellington was defeated, the Liverpool government would fall and the incoming Whig administration would make peace. Aware, too, that the British and Prussians were poles apart in their political aims and did not have a unified military command, he thought there was a good chance of driving a wedge between them and vanquishing them by local superiority of numbers. Above all, though, the political tail wagged the military dog. Napoleon had had to make concessions to get even grudging and qualified support from the notables. They would certainly not support anything more than a short campaign, and to maintain himself in power thereafter his only option would be the terror of I-793. He therefore decided to go for the preemptive strike. Yet even before he set out for Belgium, Napoleon made 3 bad errors of judgment. Even at Phil's late stage he could have had the erratic Murat on his side to command his right wing. Instead he had the newest marshal, Grouchy, whose incompetence and lack of imagination had ruined Hoch's 1796 descent on Ireland. As his principal field commander he had the headstrong and unreliable Ney, when he could have had the brilliant Suchet. Devout, too, was wasted in a purely administrative capacity at the Ministry of War, also doubling as governor of Paris. A further blow fell on June when his peerless chief of staff Berthier threw himself from a window in the Bamberg Palace in Bavaria. His place was taken by Soult, whose speciality was to issue opaque or sibylline orders that required an expert on hieroglyphics to decipher. This meant that instead of a top-flight winning combination of Suchet, Devout, Murat and Berthier, he had the 3 greatest duds among the Marshallate as his aides, Soult, Ney and Grouchy. After saying goodbye to Marie Walewska, who had rejoined him in Paris for their final period together as lovers, Napoleon left for the north. Already his health was giving cause for concern. Everyone remarked that he was obese, with a puffy face, greenish complexion, dull eyes and a heavy walk. He seemed to need far more sleep than in his vintage years and could not keep awake at night, no matter how much coffee he drank. Throughout the short Belgian campaign he was fatigued, needed lots of sleep, was lethargic and indecisive and generally prone to inertia. The omens for success were not good. The emperor left Paris at midnight on the evening of the 12th of June, lunched at Soissons, slept at Laon and arrived at Avesnes on the 1/3. Roll call next day established the army's strength at 122,000. When Napoleon crossed into Belgium by the Sambre at Charleroi on the 15th of June, his spies placed Wellington in Brussels with a mixed force of British, Dutch, Belgians and Hanoverians and Blücher at Namur with his 120,000 Prussians. The Grand Army was a better fighting force than in 1814. This time it included a credible cavalry army, the Guard and 5 army corps under Generals Drouet d'Erlon, Reil, Vandamme, Lobau and Girard. It was singularly unfortunate that the emperor had had to deploy troops in 5 other main theaters, the Vendée, the Var, the Alps, the Jura and at the frontiers of the Rhine under another old favorite, General Rapp. Had even one of these 8,000-strong forces been available for the campaign in Belgium, their presence might have made all the difference. Napoleon's strategy was to get between the 2 enemy armies, and then destroy each in turn. He decided to attack the Prussians first since Blücher was restless, and Mercurio where Wellington was cautious and slow-moving. It was therefore likely that Blücher would move faster to Wellington's aid than vice versa. On the other hand, alive to contingency, he realized his plan might miscarry, so put out patrols on both left and right as antennae, ready to deal with whichever enemy first appeared. As soon as either one was pinned, Napoleon himself with the center would move in for the coup de grace. Both Wellington and Blücher were taken by surprise by the speed of the emperor's advance. Wellington was obsessed with the idea that the movement towards Charleroi was a feint preparatory to an attack on Mons. He responded by concentrating on his outer, not his inner, flank, thus increasing the gap between him and Blücher. Military historians have severely criticized Wellington for fastening on this unlikely scenario, as a French attack on the open flank would simply have driven the 2 allied armies together. So it was that by the evening of the 1/5 Napoleon had successfully interposed himself between the 2 enemy forces, returning that night from the Duchess of Richmond's reception in Brussels, the most famous ball in history as it has been called. Wellington finally realized he had been gulled. Napoleon has humbugged me, by God. But the emperor's plans were also going awry. He gave the simple task of capturing the crossroads at Quatre Bras to Ney and Grouchy, who predictably made a mess of the task. Consumed with lethargy, the 2 marshals halted that night before achieving their objective. Their excuse was that the enemy was in possession of Quatre Bras. The reality was that just 4,000 troops, mainly Dutch, were ensconced there under Prince Bernhard of Saxe-Weimar. An energetic commander with the huge superiority in numbers enjoyed by Ney could simply have swatted such a small force aside. But when the Dutch beat off Ney's skirmishers, the bravest of the brave allowed himself to be deceived into thinking there was a considerable Allied force there. Apparently the shoulder-high ryegrass had successfully concealed the exiguous numbers of the Dutch. So egregious was Ney's incompetence on this occasion that some of his biographers have speculated that he was suffering from moral paralysis, still brooding on the conflict between his fidelity to Bonaparte and the oath of loyalty he had taken to Louis XVIII. This would be more convincing had not Ney displayed similar folly on numerous other occasions. Next day he proved the point that he was always singularly useless unless some daredevil escapade was called for. When Napoleon learned at 2 a.m. on the 16th that Quatre-Bras was still in enemy hands, he had to shelve his plan to press on to Brussels to attack Wellington. He decided to make a virtue of necessity and attack Blücher at Ligny, using Ney's forces for the coup de grace. While Grouchy engaged the Prussian left and Napoleon hurled the bulk of his troops at the center, Ney was to complete the mopping-up operations at Quatre-Bras, then swing right to Ligny and fall on the Prussian right flank. It must have been obvious that speed was essential if this operation was to be successful. But Ney compounded his tardiness of the 1/5 with lethargy on the 16th, and made no move until the early afternoon. His inactivity allowed Wellington, who arrived at Quatre-Bras at 10 a.m., to ride 8 miles for a conference with Blücher. He advised him not to offer battle if Napoleon appeared. The incredible French sloth was later blamed on a confusing order from Soult which read, "The intention of His Majesty is that you attack whatever is before you and after vigorously throwing them back, join us to envelop this corps." Crucially, the orders did not make it clear that the Ligny operation was at all times to have priority, and that Ney should not commit himself at Quatre-Bras to the point where he could no longer take part in the main battle. But a good general understands his commander-in-chief's intentions and grasps strategy as a whole. This kind of intellectual grip was quite beyond the Prince of the Muscova. Finally Ney bestirred himself. If he had launched an attack at any time before 2 p.m. on the 16th, he would easily have wrested the crossroads from the Allies. Then for an hour 8,000 Anglo-Dutch held 40,000 French troops at bay while Ney advanced with exaggerated caution, terrified that the enemy might have extra men in concealed positions. By 3 p.m. the defenders were on the point of cracking when suddenly General Picton's 8,000-strong division arrived. For a while the two forces fought a furious seesaw engagement, but then around 4:30 further large-scale reinforcements arrived under the Duke of Brunswick, and tipped the scales in the Allies' favor. A furious Ney, seeing victory snatched from his grasp, lost control of himself and ordered Kellerman's cavalry to charge the British infantry unsupported. At around 5 p.m. the dauntless horsemen formed up for what looked like a suicide mission. Against all the odds, they nearly succeeded. But then the British brought up heavy guns. The combination of artillery and packed infantry devastated the heroic French cavalry. By 6:30 p.m. the race to get reinforcements to Quatre-Bras had been easily won by Wellington. With 36,000 men he felt confident enough to order a large-scale counterattack, and by 9 p.m. he had regained all the ground taken by the French during the day. The French had taken 4,000 casualties, the Allies 4,800. With Ney's non-appearance at Ligny, the French did not achieve their aims there either. On the morning of the 16th Napoleon wrote, "In 3 hours the fate of the campaign will be decided. If Ney carries out his orders thoroughly, not a man or gun of this army in front of us will get away." At first the battle went according to plan. French cannonades devastated the exposed Prussian infantry, for the arrogant Blücher had waved away Wellington's suggestions for placing them in more hidden positions. If Ney had appeared on the flank as planned, the result would have been a crushing victory. When there was no sign of Ney and instead there came news that he was meeting stiff resistance at Quatre-Bras, Napoleon decided to call up Ney's reserve under General D'Erlon to provide the knockout blow at Ligny. What followed was one of the great fiascos in military history. D'Erlon's I Corps began the day on our 6 June on the road to Quatre-Bras, where Ney planned to use them as a surprise reinforcement thrown into the fray at the last moment. But when Napoleon realized that Ney would not be appearing at Ligny, he himself sent orders to D'Erlon to march there to play the role originally to have been acted by Ney. His courier, General d'Aille-Bedoyer, found D'Erlon's corps toiling north to Quatre-Bras and at once rerouted them east to Ligny. In one of the many misunderstandings that bedeviled this day, I Corps arrived on the French flank instead of the Prussian at around 6 p.m., causing momentary panic in the Grand Army, as it was thought that there were 22,000 enemy troops on their flank. Napoleon was just about to send in the guard when this news arrived. He was forced to suspend the operation for an hour, wasting critical time, while the confusion was sorted out. Consoling himself with the thought that at least he could now use D'Erlon's men for the coup de grace, he sent word to D'Erlon to alter course so as to come in on the Prussian flank. To his stupefaction he was informed that I Corps had disappeared. The villain was once again Ney, who spent the day in one towering tantrum after another. When he learned that the Emperor had ordered I Corps to Ligny, he lost his temper and raged. Then came an imperial aide with a message from Napoleon to take Quatre-Bras without delay. Again Ney lost his temper and raged. He told the aide caustically to report to the emperor that he could hardly take Quatre Bras without delay when Wellington's entire army was there and the emperor was ordering his best units to Ligny. When Wellington counterattacked, Ney began to panic. At risk of grave displeasure from the emperor, he overruled d'Ailly Bedoyer's orders to Durlan, making it a court-martial offense if Elcourt did not respond. Durlan was actually in sight of Ligny when he received Ney's final orders, and turned back. The upshot was that 22,000 crack French troops spent all day pointlessly marching between Ligny and Quatre Bras but seeing action in neither place. At Ligny, Napoleon ended the day far short of the sweeping victory that could have been his. Further time was lost between 6.30 and 7.30 that evening by a Prussian counterattack. Rain was already falling heavily and darkness coming down fast when the Guard finally went into action and cut a swath through the Prussians. At 8 p.m. Blücher's counterattack with cavalry was easily beaten off. Napoleon had smashed the Prussian center but the two wings got away intact under cover of darkness. If Napoleon had had 2 more hours of darkness, or if Durlan's corps had not been withdrawn, he would have won a total victory even without Ney. This would have doomed Wellington and possibly even swung the balance of the entire war in Napoleon's favor. As it was, he had sustained 0 casualties and caused Prussian losses of 16,000 men and 21 guns. There were also 9,000 Prussian deserters. Blücher himself was thrown off his horse and narrowly escaped being trampled to death by French cuirassiers. Quatre Bras and Ligny should have taught Napoleon that he could never win while he used Soult and Ney as his chief agents. Ney's timidity on the 1/5, his inactivity on the morning of the 16th, his inability to grasp the overall strategy at Ligny, and his recall of Durlan were matched only by the impenetrability of Soult's orders and the incompetence of his staff work. But the ultimate responsibility for appointing both these men rests with Napoleon. They were far from being the only senior individuals available. Perhaps Napoleon knew in his heart that the game was already up, for he went down with incapacitating illness, did not order a pursuit of the Prussians and so lost contact with them, with ultimately disastrous results. Medical historians of Napoleon claim that he was suffering from acromegaly, a disease of the pituitary gland among whose symptoms are tiredness and overoptimism, but a more likely diagnosis is a psychogenic reaction to excessive stress and extreme frustration. Napoleon still expressed himself confident of total victory next day, since 2 corps had not been in battle at all while the Guard had suffered only light casualties. But on the 17th, still suffering from a heavy cold and bladder problems, he fell back into lethargy. Nothing excuses the fact that he issued no orders until noon, thus losing the advantage he had gained by Ligny. Some military historians go further and claim that the 12 hours between 9 p.m. on the 16th and 9 a.m. on the 17th were the critical period when the Belgian campaign was lost. Ney, too, was his usual incompetent self. It is clear in retrospect that if Ney had attacked Wellington at Quatre Bras on the morning of the 17th, he could have pinned him there while Napoleon moved round the exposed flank on the Anglo-Dutch left, where the Prussian withdrawal had left them vulnerable. By the time Napoleon girded himself for action, the moment of advantage was past. After Quatre Bras, Gneisenau, taking over command from the injured Blücher, wanted to retreat north but Blücher recovered sooner than expected and overruled this. Wellington, meanwhile, elected for a perilous withdrawal from Quatre Bras to the prepared positions he had earlier identified at Mont Saint-Jean as being the best place to make a stand. Napoleon's expectations for the morning of the 17th of June were that Blücher would have retired to Liege, Ney would be in possession of Quatre Bras and Wellington would be scurrying along the road to Brussels. When he learned the truth, he had to rethink his battle plans. There seemed to be 3 obvious choices, in descending order of desirability. He could leave Ney to keep Wellington occupied while he pursued Blücher, he could send Grouchy with a skeleton force to dog Blücher's steps while he himself fell on Wellington with superior numbers, or he could divide his force, sending Grouchy with 33,000 men after Blücher while he himself attacked Wellington with the balance of the army. It was typical of this ill-starred campaign that he went for the third, and least desirable, option. Having wasted 5 hours of daylight doing nothing, he sent Grouchy after Blücher and moved against Wellington at Quatre Bras. At noon Wellington ordered a retreat from Quatre Bras to the positions at Mont Saint-Jean, near the village of Waterloo. If Napoleon had been on top form, this would have been the moment when he caught Wellington in a position where none of the Duke's normal tactics would have worked. But meanwhile another contretemps supervened to buy the Anglo-Dutch force precious time. At 1 p.m. Napoleon, finally on the move towards Quatre Bras, found Ney's force bivouacked and eating lunch as if they were on a leisurely picnic. Angrily he got them on the march but it was 2 p.m. before the chase after Wellington commenced in earnest. Ney tried to retrieve his reputation by an energetic pursuit of the Duke's rearguard but he did not discomfit the enemy to the point where Wellington was forced to turn and face him. Even so, the French might yet have overhauled him but for the outbreak of a violent afternoon thunderstorm which turned the ground into a quagmire of mud and ruled out further effective pursuit. By 6:30 p.m. Wellington reached Mont Saint-Jean. Napoleon raged that he did not have 2 more hours of daylight so that he could attack at once, but, having thrown away nearly 7 hours of daylight at the beginning of the day, his railing against fate had a hollow ring. From Mont Saint-Jean, Wellington sent a message to Blücher that he was confident of holding his position if he could have just 2 Prussian corps as reinforcement. By yet another of the twists that made the Belgian campaign a chapter of accidents for Bonaparte, the Prussians were that evening mustering at Wavre. Ironically, the net effect of Ligny and Quatre-Bras was to push the 2 Allied armies closer together. Grouchy, supposedly in hot pursuit of Blücher, had not only failed to interpose himself between the 2 Allied armies, but at 6 p.m. stopped for the night at Gembloux, 12 miles south of Wavre. Incredibly, his corps had covered just 6 miles in the whole of that day. Had Blücher gone anywhere but Wavre, or if anyone but Grouchy had been pursuing him, Wellington's position at Waterloo would already have been hopeless. At 8 p.m., at his base at the farmhouse of Belle Alliance, 2 miles south of Mont Saint-Jean, Napoleon received the astounding news that Grouchy was nowhere near Wavre's, but was complacently ensconced at Gembloux. The marshal actually had the stupid effrontery to send a reassuring message that he would be advancing on Wavre's at first light, so nothing was lost. Scarcely able to believe his eyes when he read the dispatch, the emperor sought confirmation. Aware that if, after all his efforts, the 2 Allied armies managed to combine, the tables would be turned on him, he went for a walk at IAM, accompanied only by the Grand Marshal. The torrential rainfall had eased off, and in the clear light the forest of Soignes looked as if it were on fire, lit up as it was from the glow of myriad bivouacs. At 2:30 am the rain began to pelt down once more. Napoleon grabbed some fitful sleep, only to be awakened at 4 am by a dispatch confirming Blücher's presence at Wavre's. This was the point where he should have sent an express to Grouchy, ordering him to break off the pursuit of the Prussians to Wavre and instead station himself between Waterloo and Wavre to prevent the Prussians moving west. In yet another fateful decision he delayed sending this crucial message until EOAM. On the I-8th, on the morning of Sunday I-8 June, Napoleon was once again unwell. He had slept less than 4 hours and before daybreak rode his horse in teeming rain to inspect his advanced posts. The deluge-like precipitation in the early morning was to have important effects. Not only did the waterlogged ground make it impossible for the French to maneuver their superior artillery, but the lethal impact of their cannonballs was reduced. Since round shot would not ricochet in these conditions, the artillery would not be able to tear holes in the dense British squares. When he had completed his tour of inspection, the emperor again felt tired. So fatigued was he that between EO and IAM, he fell asleep while seated on a chair on the Brussels road. In his preparations for the Battle of Waterloo, Napoleon contrived to produce a grand slam of mistakes. It is surprising that his great name as a captain has survived the lengthy checklist of errors he committed that day, or that Wellington should have gained such a great reputation for taking advantage of opportunities that were virtually handed him on a plate. The emperor seemed pleased that Wellington had the forest of Soignes at his back, making retreat impossible, but he showed consummate folly in allowing the Duke to fight on ground of List's own choosing. It almost passes belief that Wellington was yet again allowed to implement his favorite ploy of sheltering troops on reverse slopes. Surely after the Peninsular War the French were alive to this tired old dodge. Even Soult was worried about the concentrated firepower of the British squares, but Napoleon reacted to his chief of staff's warnings with arrogance and contempt. Just because you have been beaten by Wellington, you think he's a good general. I tell you, Wellington is a bad general. The English are bad troops and this affair is nothing more than eating breakfast. In his tactics for the day's battle, Napoleon could think of nothing more original than an unimaginative frontal assault. His idea was to turn Wellington's left rather than his right, both because it was weaker and to cut the Duke off from any hope of aid from the Prussians at Wavre. Moreover, if he attacked Wellington's right, there was a danger that he might lose touch with Grouchy's detachment. But, to anticipate a question the emperor was to ask himself repeatedly on this Sunday the 18th of June, where was Grouchy and what were his intentions? Had he received the emperor's latest orders and was he even now, as Napoleon hoped, doubling back to take part in the battle? Grouchy was to be the greatest single failure in the Battle of Waterloo, so it is not surprising that the issue of his culpability has exercised military historians ever since. His defenders point to the impenetrability, gibberish would be a better word, of the orders received from Soult, which were worded as follows: His Majesty desires that you will head for Wavre in order to draw near to us, and to place yourself in touch with our operations, and to keep up your communications with us, pushing before you those positions of the Prussian army which have taken this direction, and which have halted at Wavre. This place you ought to reach as soon as possible. Since Wavre lay to the north of Grouchy and the Emperor to the west, the orders were nonsensical, moreover pushing the Prussians before him. In the context of drawing near could mean only driving Blücher to the field of Waterloo, the exact opposite of Napoleon's intentions. Grouchy solved the conundrum by fastening on the three words head for Wavre and ignoring everything else. It must have been obvious to the merest lieutenant in Grouchy's corps that the Emperor's overall intention was to impede a junction between the two allied armies, and that preventing this had to be Grouchy's main aim. At Wavre, Blücher sent Bülow on a flank march west to Waterloo. If Grouchy had used even moderate intelligence and sent just part of his force west, they would have come upon Bülow and prevented his rescue mission. But Grouchy's idiocy did not end there. Having assured Napoleon that he would be setting out at first light for Wavre's, he delayed departure from Gembloux until 10 a.m. when firing was heard from the direction of Waterloo after midday. Grouchy's senior generals, Girard especially, urged him to turn round and march to the sound of the guns. Grouchy refused. There can be no excuses or exculpation for this clear dereliction of duty. A Marshal of France was supposed to be a man of initiative and intelligence, not an automaton blindly obeying orders. It was Grouchy's clear duty to head in the direction of the fighting, as the great Desaix had done at Marengo. When he heard that the plotting Grouchy was determinedly heading towards him at Wavre's, Blücher sent word to Bülow on no account to be swayed from his mission. Grouchy deserves every syllable of the scathing judgment Napoleon eventually passed on his incompetent subordinate. Marshal Grouchy, with 34,000 men and 108 guns, discovered the secret, which seemed an impossibility, of being neither on the field of battle at Mont Saint-Jean, nor at Wavre's during the day of the 18th. Marshal Grouchy's conduct was just as unpredictable as if his army had experienced an earthquake on the way which had swallowed it up. On the field of Waterloo, Napoleon began the battle supremely confident. With 72,000 men against the Anglo-Dutch 68,000, we have 90 chances in our favor and not 10 against. The peculiarity of the Battle of Waterloo was its narrow compass. With 140,000 men crammed into 3 square miles, the front was only 4 kilometers wide, as against 10 at Austerlitz. Wellington had his men deployed along the Z-mile ridge of Mont Saint-Jean, with 17,000 sent to the west near Halle to stymie any French outflanking movements. His main strength was concentrated on his right, doubtless because he expected the advancing Prussian corps to safeguard his left. He established forward strong points at the hamlets of La Haye and Peyplot, the large sprawling farm known as La Haye Saint on his left and the shadow of Hougoumont on his right. The opening salvos from the artillery took place at around 1:35. Then Napoleon made yet another of his many mistakes this day by allowing his brother Jérôme to assault the shadow of Hougoumont on Wellington's right. This position was heavily defended by the Scots and Coldstream Guards and, in terms of Napoleon's overall tactics, was an irrelevance. The idiotic Jérôme chose to sacrifice his infantry, General Rile's 2 corps, by a direct assault on Hougoumont when the obvious course was to bring up heavy artillery and blast holes in the walls. As the hand-to-hand fighting around Hougoumont became increasingly bitter, Napoleon did not intervene to halt it or take decisive action, but simply allowed more and more French troops to be sucked into the pointless conflict. Wellington sent only slender reinforcements to Hougoumont, but the best part of an entire French corps was soon pinned down in a slugging match for an unimportant secondary target. The battle for Hougoumont went on all day. Flames began to engulf it around 3:30 p.m., but the fortress never fell. The French did succeed in breaking into the courtyard but were soon driven out, and fighting was still going on at 9 that night. It was not until 1:30 that Napoleon finally ordered a cannonade against Wellington's center with 80 big guns. This fusillade was largely ineffective, as Wellington ordered his men to lie down on the reverse slopes and the cannonballs whizzed over their heads. Only the brigade under Bylent in the front of the ridge took significant casualties. Then Durland's I Corps went into action against Wellington's left center at around 2 p.m.